The message came through in the dead of night, its urgency palpable even through the glowing red hologram. Captain Adrian Calloway stood motionless before the projection, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The voice of Ambassador Talith from the Galactic Empire cut through the silence like a blade. Humanity is weak. Your kind has been warned, and yet you persist in your insolence. Today, we prove the truth of your insignificance. Talitha's words hung in the air, cold and final. The message wasn't meant for diplomatic negotiation, it was an execution. A human child, no older than 6, had been publicly killed by the Empire to send a message. Earth was nothing more than a minor annoyance in their vast, unyielding empire. Calloway felt the room constrict around him, every muscle in his body seizing with a cocktail of rage and disbelief. How could they? A child? In a galaxy where human life had always been undervalued, this act of cruelty was a declaration of war. Captain, General Cara Diaz's voice broke through the tension. She stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she processed the message's implications. We have to move, now. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the flickering projection of the Empire's ambassador, his heart hammering in his chest. The words were there, an accusation, a challenge. You are no longer welcome here. They had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Adrian finally turned to face her, his eyes hard, betraying none of the pain that churned inside. What do we do now? We prepare, she said simply. Diaz's expression was calm, almost too calm, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the weight of the moment. For all her experience, for all the strategic brilliance she embodied, she understood this was no ordinary crisis. This was personal. Adrian clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the fury building inside him. He had fought for peace, worked tirelessly to keep Earth's fragile status quo intact within the Galactic Council. But this was not something he could forgive. Not this time. Mobilize the fleet, he said, his voice cold but resolute. If they want war, we'll give them one. Minutes later, Earth's command center buzzed with activity. Military officers rushed to their stations, their expressions tense, while engineers scrambled to assess the readiness of the fleet. Adrian watched it all, his mind racing faster than the engines that would soon power Earth's ships into battle. The Galactic Empire had just made their move, and now, humanity had no choice but to retaliate. Diaz joined him at the central command table, her eyes scanning the holographic display of Earth's forces. We'll need to strike fast. Our fleet is smaller than theirs, but we've got one advantage: flexibility. The Empire's bureaucracy and rigid command structure will slow them down. We can't afford to play their game. Adrian nodded, his mind already working through the options. We'll hit their supply lines first. Cripple them before they get to Earth. His voice was low, but the weight of his words settled heavily in the room. And then? Diaz asked, her eyes searching his face, trying to gauge how far he was willing to go. Adrian's gaze hardened. Then we wiped them out. Every last one of them. The tension between them was palpable. Diaz, ever the pragmatist, understood the stakes. She had always been the voice of reason in their partnership, questioning when to act, when to delay, when to negotiate. But Adrian's determination had shifted. He was no longer the diplomat trying to find common ground. His need for vengeance now burned hotter than any military strategy. She didn't challenge him. She didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake. As the fleet assembled, readying for battle, Adrian stood alone in his quarters, staring out at the stars. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the engines beneath the floor. His mind replayed the image of the child, the innocent victim of the Empire's brutal message. That image, innocent and haunting, fueled his resolve. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Diaz standing there, her expression unreadable. She said nothing for a moment, then took a step closer. This won't be easy. We've never fought anything like this before. I know, he replied, his voice tight. But we've fought for this moment. For the chance to defend Earth. They made it personal. Diaz studied him for a long moment before responding. "I've known you a long time, Adrian. I've seen you fight with everything you have. But this isn't just a battle for Earth's survival. This is about your vengeance. Don't let it blind you." He nodded slowly, but deep inside, he knew she was right. The child's death had ignited something deep within him, a fury he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But now it was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, and he didn't know how to control it. "We're ready," she said, her tone steely but soft. "Let's show them what we can do." Adrian took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of his command chair. "Ready the fleet. Let's make sure they never forget why humanity is not to be underestimated." As the first wave of ships ascended from Earth's orbit, the stars outside the command window seemed to pulse with anticipation. Adrian stood at the helm, his mind focused, but his heart heavy. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was a war against an empire that had underestimated humanity's capacity for resilience. The message was clear: they had crossed a line, and humanity would make them regret it. As the fleet moved toward the unknown expanse of space, Adrian couldn't shake the image of the child's innocent face. He would make sure it was the last time anyone ever underestimated Earth. The stakes were higher now than ever before. And there was no turning back. The hum of the fleet's engines resonated through the command deck as Captain Adrian Calloway stood at the forefront, his eyes scanning the holographic displays that stretched before him. Thousands of ships, each carrying Earth's hopes and defiance, glided silently through space, poised to strike at the heart of the Galactic Empire. A single word pulsed through his mind: revenge. "Status report, Commander," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. Commander Elias Vance, a grizzled veteran with years of service etched into his weathered face, tapped at his console. "All ships are ready, sir. We're positioned just beyond the Empire's defense perimeter. Intel suggests their fleet won't mobilize for another few hours. We have the element of surprise." Adrian nodded but didn't smile. Surprise had always been the human advantage, but now it felt hollow. They were up against an empire that had enslaved, conquered, and destroyed entire worlds. Earth had been a mere footnote in their grand design until now. And yet, with every passing moment, the realization sank deeper: this wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a declaration of humanity's place in the galaxy. He turned to General Kara Diaz, who was observing the tactical readouts at the far side of the room. Her eyes flicked from one display to the next, her brow furrowed in concentration. Diaz was the strategist, the voice of reason when emotions threatened to overtake logic. But now, even she seemed on edge. "We can't afford to waste time," she said quietly, approaching Adrian. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the tension that ran through her. "We hit their supply lines, cripple their resources, and get out before they can retaliate." "I know the plan, Kara," Adrian replied, his voice tight. "But it's not just about crippling them. This is about sending a message. To them. To the entire galaxy." Kara met his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And that message is? That we're not weak. That we're not going to sit here while they pick us apart one by one," he said, his voice hardening. "That they've made a mistake." She didn't argue. They both knew the stakes. Earth was outnumbered, outgunned, but they had something the Empire didn't: a relentless drive to survive. To fight. To make their mark. The first strike came swiftly. With the fleet positioned just beyond the Empire's detection range, Adrian had chosen a small convoy of freighters hauling critical supplies from one of the Empire's outer colonies. It was a simple target, low-hanging fruit, but striking it would send shockwaves through their defenses. If humanity could hit their most vulnerable points, the Empire's invincibility would crumble. "Shields up, weapons primed," Adrian ordered, watching the series of green lights flash across the ship's systems. "Initiate Phase 1. A chorus of commands echoed across the command deck as the fleet advanced toward the convoy. In the eerie silence of space, the tension mounted. Adrian's breath was shallow, his mind still racing with thoughts of vengeance. But there was no time for hesitation. The Empire was watching. The time for diplomacy had passed. Within moments, the fleet engaged. Precision strikes decimated the convoy, leaving no survivors. The convoy's escorts, a handful of smaller destroyers, were swiftly obliterated by Earth's firepower. The explosion of bright, chaotic fire lit up the dark canvas of space. Adrian stood motionless, watching the carnage unfold. The hum of his ship's weapons, the brilliance of the explosions, the disintegration of the freighters, they were all reminders of the brutal truth. The Empire had taken everything from them, and now, there would be no mercy. Mission complete, Vance called out, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. The convoy is neutralized. We've left a message, sir. Adrian's lips twitched in the slightest of smiles, but it didn't reach his eyes. The strike had been efficient, devastating, but it hadn't been enough. Not yet. We move to the next target, Adrian said firmly. We don't stop until they feel our wrath. The fleet continued its assault, targeting smaller supply lines, unguarded outposts, and critical communication relays. Each strike was a calculated move in the larger game, each one designed to weaken the Empire's grip on the galaxy. But with every ship destroyed, every plan carried out, the feeling of urgency grew. They were drawing closer to the Empire's main forces, and soon, retaliation would come. Kara's voice crackled through the intercom. Adrian, we've just intercepted a transmission. The Empire is aware of our movements. They've begun to mobilize. Adrian cursed under his breath, his mind working furiously. They had expected the Empire to react, but not this quickly. His instincts screamed at him to push forward, to keep the pressure on. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. The longer they stayed in the Empire's territory, the more dangerous it would become. Prepare for a counteroffensive, Adrian ordered, his voice sharp. We need to make sure they know we can fight back. He turned to Diaz, who was already adjusting the fleet's trajectory. It's now or never, she said grimly. If we don't strike fast, they'll have us surrounded. It's not just the Empire we're facing anymore. It's their entire fleet, and it's closing in. Adrian's hand tightened on the edge of the command table, his knuckles white. He'd known this was coming, but now that it was here, there was no turning back. The Empire had underestimated humanity's will to fight. It was time to show them the consequences of their arrogance. We fight, Adrian said, his voice filled with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing there's nothing left to lose. We fight until every last one of them is crushed. The alarms began to blare, signaling the approach of enemy reinforcements. Adrian's heart rate spiked as his hands flew across the controls, positioning Earth's fleet for what would likely be a battle to the death. The galaxy had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now the Empire would learn exactly what that meant. The first shots of the real war were about to be fired, and there would be no turning back. The cold vacuum of space enveloped the fleet as Adrian Calloway stared out through the observation window of the command bridge. The stars, pinpricks of light against the infinite darkness, seemed distant and indifferent. But inside the heart of the fleet, tension was palpable, a storm waiting to burst. Enemy fleet confirmed, Captain, Elias Vance said, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of urgency. They're closing fast. 36 ships, at least. Heavy cruiser class. We've made a dent, but they're not going to let us leave easily. Adrian didn't reply immediately, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the control panel. The brief euphoria of their initial strikes had faded. Reality was setting in. The Empire wasn't simply going to collapse under the weight of one or two well-placed blows. They had underestimated the resolve of humanity before, but no more. We'll make them regret that underestimation, Adrian muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the tactical map. General Kara Diaz approached, her expression unreadable but her posture tense. We've got a narrow window before they catch up to us. We can't afford to lose more ships, not now. Adrian turned to face her, his mind racing. The attack had been swift and brutal, but the Empire was too vast, too organized. They had struck at the heart of their supply chain, but now came the retaliation. The strike against the convoy had sparked a chain reaction. The enemy had mobilized faster than expected, and Earth's fleet was dangerously outnumbered. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about making sure their fight meant something. "We don't back down," Adrian said, his voice cold. "We fight until they know that Earth isn't just a dot on a map anymore. We're their nightmare." The tension on the command deck grew. Officers moved quickly, their voices rising in a mix of urgency and resolve. Everyone had their role to play, and they all understood the stakes. This was no longer just a skirmish, it was the beginning of something much bigger. "We'll engage them head-on," Adrian continued, his jaw set. "We've got the firepower, and they won't expect us to be this aggressive. We'll hit them hard, and we'll make it count." Kara's gaze lingered on him for a moment, searching for hesitation. Finding none, she nodded sharply. "We've trained for this. We've got one chance to make them regret their actions, and we take it." The bridge hummed with activity as the fleet's ships, including the massive carrier Resolute that Adrian commanded, began to maneuver into position. The enemy fleet was coming into view, a dark armada silhouetted against the backdrop of distant stars. Their ships were enormous, their guns massive, but the humans had something the Empire did not: improvisation, ferocity, and a unity born from desperation. As the ships locked into their attack formations, Adrian's mind shifted gears, analyzing every angle. Earth had no desire for prolonged war, they simply wanted a message sent. The first strike had been swift, but now, humanity would have to show their strength not just through firepower, but through strategy. "Captain, the enemy is within range," Vance called from the tactical station, his voice tight with the adrenaline that had begun to surge through everyone on board. "They're about to open fire." "Brace for impact," Adrian ordered, his voice ringing with authority. The hum of the ship's engines faded as the crew fell into a practiced silence. The Resolute shuddered as the first wave of enemy fire splashed against its shields. Sparks flew from consoles around the bridge, but Adrian barely flinched. His gaze remained fixed on the tactical display, his mind already calculating their next move. "We're not done yet," he said, gritting his teeth. "Prepare countermeasures. Now." The ship's weapons systems flared to life, and the Resolute surged forward. The enemy fleet, though larger and more heavily armed, was caught off guard by the sudden aggression. Adrian's strategy was simple: strike first, strike fast, and disorient the enemy long enough to create chaos. He wasn't concerned with taking down their entire fleet. All he cared about was sending a message that would be felt across the galaxy. "Lock onto their lead cruiser," Adrian commanded, watching as the Resolute's massive weapons batteries powered up. Full barrage. The cruiser's shields flared brightly as the first volley of missiles streaked across space, striking with pinpoint precision. The impact reverberated across the battlefield as the cruiser buckled under the assault. It wasn't destroyed, but it was forced into a defensive posture, its momentum stalling for precious seconds. "Direct hit." "The cruiser is slowing," Vance reported, his voice tinged with excitement. "They're regrouping." Adrian didn't hesitate. "Now. All ships, attack pattern Alpha. Take them apart piece by piece." As the Resolute led the charge, the rest of the fleet fell in behind, their coordinated fire hammering into the enemy ships. A barrage of missiles and plasma fire filled the void, exploding against the hulls of the Empire's warships. For every ship that took a hit, another human vessel dove in to create a diversion, luring the Empire's forces into a web of calculated chaos. But the fight wasn't without its cost. Earth's fleet wasn't invincible. The Resolute took another hit, this time breaching its outer layers of armor, and several smaller ships flared out in a series of fiery explosions. "We're taking damage, Captain," Kara called out. "We've lost the starboard turret, and 2 frigates are down." Adrian clenched his fists, frustration and rage boiling beneath the surface. But even as his crew faced destruction, there was no retreat. "Not now. Push forward," Adrian shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We fight for Earth, no one else will ever make us bow." The battle raged on. With each passing second, the tides began to shift. Earth's fleet, though battered, had proven something the Empire had never counted on: resilience. Humanity wasn't just surviving this war, they were winning. The Resolute fired another volley, its weapons devastating the shield of the lead cruiser. But as the explosion lit up space, a warning flashed on the tactical screen: something new, something unexpected. "Captain, we've got an unknown vessel entering the battlefield," Vance said, his voice alarmed. Adrian's stomach tightened. The Empire was bringing reinforcements. And this time, it wasn't just another cruiser. "We're not done yet," Adrian muttered, his gaze hardening. "Let's show them why they should fear humanity." The battle was far from over, and humanity's wrath had only just begun. The sky above Earth was no longer the peaceful blue that once greeted humanity each morning. Now, it was filled with streaks of light, the aftermath of a battle that had torn through space like a furious storm. In the command center of the Resolute, Adrian Calloway stood at the helm, staring at the display as the tactical map shifted with each passing moment. His jaw was tight, eyes focused, calculating the next move in a war that was becoming more than just a fight for survival. It was becoming personal. "Captain, the enemy's reinforcement fleet is here," Elias Vance reported, his voice betraying a hint of anxiety. "And they've brought something different." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He knew the stakes had escalated, but this was something else entirely. He had expected reinforcements, but not this. "Patch it through," Adrian ordered, his voice sharp. The bridge fell into an uneasy silence as Vance worked quickly, linking into the enemy communications. Seconds later, the feed flickered to life, revealing an image of the Imperial fleet's newest commander. The alien was unlike any species Adrian had encountered before: tall, with silver skin that shimmered in the light of the stars, and eyes that glowed a sickly green. Its expression was unreadable, but the presence it exuded was chilling, as if this being carried the weight of an entire empire's wrath. "I am Draxus, commander of the Imperial Armada," the alien's voice rang out, deep and authoritative. "Your resistance is a waste. You will fall like the others." The feed cut abruptly, leaving Adrian with a single, harrowing thought: Earth was facing something far worse than they had anticipated. "Who the hell is Draxus?" Cara Diaz muttered, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the tactical display. "This changes everything." Adrian's mind raced. Draxus was no ordinary commander. The Empire's vast military force had its fair share of ruthless leaders, but this Draxus, felt different. His presence wasn't just that of a soldier, it was the feeling of an executioner, the harbinger of doom. The kind of leader who inspired fear in even the most seasoned warriors. "This isn't just about tactics anymore," Adrian said, his voice steady but with an edge of anger. "This is a message from the Empire. They think they can break us." Cara crossed her arms, a fire in her eyes. "Let them try. We've taken the first blow. Now it's time to show them who they're messing with." The Resolute surged forward, cutting through the empty void of space like a blade through silk. Adrian's hand gripped the command console, his eyes scanning the enemy fleet ahead. The silver-skinned alien, Draxus, was commanding the front line, seemingly unbothered by the chaos unfolding around him. But Adrian knew better than to assume the Empire was growing complacent. Draxus had been sent to put an end to their resistance, and he would not fail. "Incoming fire in 5 seconds." Vance shouted, his voice urgent. The ship rocked as the first wave of enemy missiles slammed against their shields, shaking the crew to their core. Sparks flew from consoles, and alarms blared throughout the ship. Adrian's gaze hardened as he steadied himself. This was no longer a skirmish, it was a war for the future of humanity. "Return fire. All batteries, fire at will." Adrian commanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the bridge. The Resolute's weapons roared to life, a massive volley of missiles and plasma bolts surging forward. The enemy fleet was large, but it was no match for the precision and intensity of Earth's firepower. Every shot they fired carried the weight of their cause, a message to the Empire that humanity would never bow. Direct hit on their lead destroyer. Vance called out, his voice filled with exhilaration. They're retaliating with full force. Adrian's eyes never left the tactical map, his mind running at full speed. The battle was a whirlwind of destruction and chaos, the vacuum of space now a deadly arena where the fate of billions hung in the balance. Keep pressing them, Adrian ordered. We show them no mercy. The battle dragged on, the Resolute and its fleet relentlessly pushing forward, their weapons cutting through the enemy's defenses. But the Imperial forces weren't backing down. The reinforcements had arrived in full force, their ships massive and heavily armed. The silver-skinned fleet commander, Draxus, moved with ruthless efficiency, directing the counterattacks with surgical precision. We're losing ground, Kara said, her voice tight as the ship shuddered from another blast. The enemy's pushing us back. Adrian gritted his teeth. They had come so far, but they were outnumbered. Humanity's fleet was smaller, less equipped, and the Empire's forces were now coming down on them with overwhelming strength. The odds were rapidly turning against them. We won't back down, Adrian said, his tone unwavering. We fight for every inch. This is our home, and we will defend it. The tension on the bridge grew thicker as the enemy closed in, their ships forming a tight perimeter around the Resolute. The sound of weapons fire and the hum of the ship's engines filled the air, but underneath it all, there was a palpable sense of dread. Draxus was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike, and the humans had no illusions about the kind of leader he was. The Resolute shuddered again, this time more violently. Sparks flew from the ceiling, and the lights flickered. Adrian looked over at Kara, his eyes hardening with resolve. We need a new plan, he said. We have to break their formation. We're too close to their fleet, Kara pointed out, her voice laced with frustration. If we make a run for it, we risk getting torn apart. Adrian's mind raced. He needed a way to disrupt the enemy's formation, to create an opening large enough to strike at Draxus directly. He knew the answer wasn't simply in firepower, it was in timing, precision, and unpredictability. If the Empire was used to anything, it was overwhelming force. They had to make them feel the chaos of a battle they couldn't control. He turned toward the tactical station, his voice calm but filled with the weight of the situation. Vance, ready the EMP. We're going to blind them. Then, we strike. As Vance set to work, Adrian felt the weight of what was about to come. The battle was reaching its climax, and the next move would determine everything. If they failed now, humanity might not get another chance. But if they succeeded, it would send a shockwave across the galaxy. We fight now, Adrian said, his voice filled with determination. And the storm of humanity's wrath was only just beginning.